All right, welcome to it's actually going to be a two-part lecture series. In part one, right now, we're going to talk about site factors and why they matter when we're talking about industrial location. And then in part two, we're going to talk about situation factors and why they matter in industrial location. So the slides themselves were designed to accompany the book The Cultural Landscape, with the exception of one slide that I did insert myself just to do some reminders. So, by the way, and I'm Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the day. So, just to think back to our first unit, right, and kind of remind you what is that definition of site. Site is really, it's kind of a form of absolute location, okay? And specifically what it looks at are those traits that are unique to a given area. Okay? So when we talked about this in Unit 1, we spent a lot of time talking about physical traits of location. Right, so we talked about the site of Seattle as being very hilly, and we talked about the site of Seattle as being near the water, for example. But there are also human or cultural traits to location that we need to account for as well. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about with this lecture. Not all, but a lot of it. Okay, so moving on and talk about those human factors in site. Probably the most important site factor when we're talking about industrial location is labor force. And there's a few things that people look for when they are trying to decide where to site a factory and they're talking about labor. First is cost. Second is skill sets or education levels. Okay. And in a perfect world, what factory managers want, or what industrialists want, is they want workers who are educated, can do the job, but they don't want to pay any more money than they have to. So what they do is they look for where can we maximize those two conditions. And to do that, part of what they do is they tend to agglomerate, right? Think back, agglomeration is when you've got a bunch of companies all in the same industry that group together, and as a result they're able to spread out the cost of certain things, one of which is the education of labor forces, right? So we're going to look at a few examples here during our on the next several slides. And so we're going to start out, we're going to talk about, and these are all related to textiles, they're all related to clothing. We're going to talk about textile and apparel spinning, okay? And that's just the actual, like, spinning the thread to make the cloth. And then we're going to talk about weaving, which is the process of actually making the cloth, out of which then fabrics or out of which the clothes are cut, or towels, or whatever type of fabric, whatever kind of end product we're talking about. And then the last one, we're going to talk about where do we find the assembly. And each of these, by the way, requires different skill sets, and each one as you go up actually requires more specialized, increasingly specialized skill sets, especially when we're talking about technology and the like. And so first one we want to look at is cotton yarn, okay, which is somewhat specialized, but not overly so. Okay, we've got a world map, of course. So we're looking at the global scale, and we're looking at the differences between countries, and our measurements, we're looking at metric tons of cotton yarn. Okay, the place that produces the most, China. This is in many ways, if you know anything at all about textile production, not really surprising. Also not surprising, right, is the volume produced in India. Pakistan surprised me a little bit, but not necessarily a ton. Okay, a little surprised about the U.S. because the U.S. is kind of an expensive place to do stuff like this. And then we've got Argentina, right? We've got Russia. Let's see here, and I'm drawing a blank on the big one that's not Mongolia, between Russia and China, but that's okay. I'm sure you can figure it out by looking at a world map. But anyways, what we're looking at is these are areas that produce lots of cotton yarn that then gets turned into the fabrics that we use, right? And these are areas where education levels are either high or reasonably high, and wages are going to be reasonably so as well. And then when we talk about woven cotton fabric, okay, now our measurement unit is square meters. Okay, And we're looking, as high as 20 billion or more. Somehow not surprising, Asia got a big chunk of that, right? India, China, some of the little countries right in around them. Russia also a major producer, the US a reasonably major producer, right? And this is something that, again, requires a little more skill set, but is still doesn't necessarily require a ton of education. Doesn't, you do need to be able to work the looms and things like that to make woven cotton fabric, but it's not like it requires a college degree or things like that. These are skill sets that you can pick up on the job with reasonable ease if you're at least somewhat intelligent. And last but not least, what we're going to look at is final production, right? Production of clothing, in this case, women's blouses. Okay. And what you'll notice is we're seeing lots and lots of overlap, right? China's still pretty high up there, right? They produce anywhere from 10 to 99 million women's blouses a year. Okay. Russia, again, a higher producer. This kind of makes sense. Australia, we saw it in terms of making fabric, kind of makes sense. The US, same thing, kind of makes sense, right? And the trick with the production of women's blouses is it actually requires even a slightly higher level of education than making woven cotton fabric, in large part because not only do you have to be able to work the presses to cut out the fabric pieces, right, but then you have to be able to fit the fabric pieces together to run them through the machines. And most of this work, by the way, especially when we're talking about sewing the shirts together, is still done largely by hand. I mean, robots don't sew your shirts together, right? There are people in factories who sew shirts all day. Okay, so this requires a reasonable amount of education, and as a result, pays reasonably well. And so, not surprisingly, what we see are those areas that are well known for textiles or for fabrics that have a big industry surrounding that in general, also tend to produce a lot of the finalized products. And even more so, what we see is a little bit of a reversal, where the finalized products, the part that requires more education, actually gets done, more likely to get done in our more developed areas of the world, where more education is much more common. Right? So, and this is actually our last slide. When we talk about site factors, we're not just talking about labor, though, right? Not just the availability of labor, not just the availability of educated labor, things like that. But we also need to talk about the ability to get a hold of things like land for a factory, right? In some areas of the world are easier to do this in than others. In the US, for example, very easy overall to go out and go buy a parcel of land to build a factory on. You find some place that's zoned right, it's very easy. You go down to City Hall and they'll tell you what parcels are zoned which ways, and they'll help you find maps, right? You go to the owner, you make an offer, they sell or don't, you work through real estate agents. This is very, very easy to do here in the US. In some areas, for instance, India, it's significantly harder to buy land or buy large parcels of land to put factories on, and to some degree, this is by design, because what they want to do is make sure that they are maintaining their farming industry and that they're also not allowing their less educated farmers to get taken advantage of. Okay. In general, factories work best in rural sites. Okay. Partially just because there's more land available and it's cheaper, and transportation these days is so much cheaper that we don't need to be as close to the market. But also what they want to look at is what are some of the environmental factors that go into this. So for instance, if I need cheap and abundant energy, I want to make sure that I'm locating in an area where I'm going to get that cheap and abundant energy, where I'm going to be able to rely on it on a regular basis. Right? If I need lots of water, I need to make sure that I can do that. If I need to know what the environmental rules are and things like that. And so those matter, right? And those are human characteristics that are endemic to a place. Because a lot of that stuff can be, like, rules obviously are human, but a lot of the rest of it can be adjusted pretty easily. Water, for instance, or access to electricity. When we talk about site factors, we also need to talk about capital. Okay? And capital in this case, capital with an A, is not like the capital city. Right here in Washington, the capital is Olympia. Capital with an A, C-A-P-I-T-A-L, is machines, it's factories, it's knowledge. Okay, it's the things you need to make industry work. And that's something that you've got to make sure that you have in your location. Because if I can't buy the sewing machines I need for my textile factory, if I can buy them in one place but I can't ship them to where my factory is going to be, that's a problem, right? That becomes a huge problem for me. It's just like if I find the perfect site but I can't gain title to it, that's a problem. Or, you know, where I can gain title but then I can't get the energy I need. These are problems. So these are some of the first things when factory owners or industrialists are going through and they're checklisting. What do we need? These are some of the earliest things that they look at, because if they can't get the land, if they can't get the if they can't get the water they need, if the environmental rules are too onerous, if they can't get the capital that they need, then they're not even going to consider a place. That's before they even get into the situation factors, which is what we're actually going to talk about with the next lecture that I upload. Okay, so just to go back and review, this lecture has been talking about site factors that are related to industrial location, and we talked a lot about human factors, in particular about where do we find specific types of more education levels and things like that, and talk about why do we see certain things where we see them, right? And then we also talked a little bit about land, we talked a little bit about capital, and what do those things mean when we're talking about industries. So if you have any questions, by all means, please feel free to come see me and ask them, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions I can. I'll see you next time we have class.